You know, what's his name? LePage tried to remove a mural that was done supporting unions or something. You know, it
Yes,
just
yes,
stupid
I
crap
remember
happening.
that. I definitely remember that. And there's a sort of comparable thing here. Do you remember? I don't know if it was when you were around here in Madison, if it was here, but do you know about the Haven Center? It's social sciences kind of I don't know what the generic word for this entity is, but anyway, it's they they put on lots of lectures and talks, and a lot of them are about labor history, um, and then also um, other other things that these people wouldn't like. And sure enough, two legislators here in Wisconsin were trying to defund it.
Of
Um,
course they were. Yes, of course they
you know, never mind that anyone that lives in Madison knows what building is the business school, but most people probably never even heard of the Haven Center. Just like, eh.
were. Well, you know. Anyway, time to begin the begun. Welcome to Dis and Dat, the 20th, and I'm pretty sure this is the correct date. Um, Welcome to Dis and Dat. We're going to talk about high-powered money and modern monetary theory. Oh, uh, Joe has put up the schedule for the next couple, or is doing the schedule for the next couple of days, and in advance because he's, moving all over the place and wherever he is. And so what's coming up is, I think tomorrow is Marks on Geology, which hopefully will be interesting to some people. And then on Saturday and Sunday at 3 p.m., we're going to do chapters 14 and 15 of Marx's Volume 1 of Capital, the 2024 edition. So hope you'll tune in for that. I will actually read completely both chapters because they're relatively short and they can be done in the time we have allocated. All right, today I'm going to talk about again, and it there's an arcane aspect to modern money theory. It Some people in modern money theory will disclaim any connection to Marx, and it doesn't really matter. But as we were talking about yesterday, there is a way of talking about modern money theory where, it implicates the state. It is about state power, the state's ability to control the money supply. And some people don't like that. They seem to think that it would just do whatever it's going to do. But, agency is necessary. You actually have to manipulate crap. And the argument today is one that's largely, as they say, endogenous. That is going to talk about more about factors internal to a nation state, which is what we were talking about yesterday. But the idea is that America, when you talk about dollars, it's a reserve currency. It dominates the world, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so there are other elements at work that require a lot more policy and state intervention. Now, I mean, if you had an electronic state, not the one that the libertarians want, but it is an imaginary state, of course. But if it were as efficient as it could be, driven by AI and other kinds of rule generating algorithms, you could actually clean up a lot of this stuff. But the fact of the matter is, ideology intervenes. And also power intervenes with not necessarily discrete entities. People who have a lot of power and a lot of money try to put their thumbs on the scales. And of course, that's what we see currently with two idiots essentially screwing up the entire national economy in less than a month, less than 2 months. The national economy is going to be screwed. So, with that in mind, and if you wanted to put modern monetary theory in place, you need a lot of state power. I mean, in order to get, because it only works if you can get, certain things to all fit together. That is, you need to have, Treasury on your side, the Reserve Bank system. You need to have a cooperative Congress. You need to have a judicial system that will support the economic arguments, and we have none of that right now. We have none of that, and so it's much more it's much more illusory than we think, and it is not a solution. I mean, it is a solution under certain constraints, but it clearly has other issues. There are other issues. Once you start messing with the monetary system, you have to start worrying about other things outside of that, which is other monies, international monies, other forms of capital, not other forms of money. It's not an identical question. It is a critique of capital, but you need to sort of say, the money system has this sort of commodity form that's very necessary. It's abstract, it's complicated, it has lots of levers that you can control, but it really does require a certain type of state power, not one that's autocratic, just simply one that has rules that, democratically enabled, supported, authenticated rules. We're nowhere near that, and we're actually on the cusp of other people putting in things that are um, ruleless, as they say, or ones that will favor, in the libertarian sense, people who have more stuff and who don't want to give up their stuff. And that's pretty much what it boils down to, as it has always. Modern monetary theory or modern money theory, MMT, is a heterodox macroeconomic theory that describes currency as a public monopoly and unemployment as evidence that a currency monopolist is overly restricting the supply of the financial assets needed to pay taxes and satisfy savings desires. So, according to MMT, governments do not need to worry about accumulating debt since they can pay interest by printing money. Now, that automatically is hyperinflationary and blah, 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 blah. That has all kinds of other implications. So we'll get to that. MMT argues that the primary risk, once the economy reaches full employment, also problematic, is inflation, which acts as the only constraint on spending. MMT also argues that inflation can be controlled by increasing taxes on everyone to reduce the spending capacity of the private sector. So there's all kinds of issues just even in that one little Wikipedia paragraph. Let me finish off the Wikipedia description, and then we get the things that I'll read today are a joint paper by some major lights of MMT to their critics. This was in 2019, I think, and pretty much summarizes the issues that you got to worry about. And there's a lot of moving parts. It is why MMT has never, I think there were marginal changes in the administrations that had MMT scholars in various places in government. Uh, but the United States government has never endorsed an MMT position. I mean, if you put an MMT person in the Treasury, that might have done it. But Janet Yellen is no MMT person. She's a Keynesian. Anyway, MMT is opposed to the mainstream understanding of macroeconomic theory and has been criticized heavily by many mainstream economists. MMT is also strongly opposed by members of, yes, the Austrian School of Economics, Hayek, von Mises, blah, 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 and all those libertarians. MMT's main tenets are that a government that issues its own fiat money, that is its own currency, can pay for goods, services, and financial assets without a need to first collect money in the form of taxes or debt issuance in advance of such purchases. Now, that alone is problematic, but we won't tackle that right now. Cannot be forced to default on debt denominated in its own currency, is limited in its money creation and purchases only by inflation, which accelerates once the real resources, that is, labor, capital, and natural resources of the economy, are utilized at full employment, also problematic. Now, it also should strengthen automatic stabilizers to control demand pull inflation rather than relying upon discretionary tax changes. This is another controversial issue. Issues bonds as monetary policy device rather than as a funding device, which is, sort of counterintuitive for some people. Uses taxation to provide the fiscal space to spend without causing inflation and also to give a value to the currency. Taxation is often said in MMT not to fund the spending of a currency issuing government, but without it, no real spending is, of course, possible. Now, these first four MMT tenets, do not conflict with mainstream economics. There's an argument in each case, and they're conditioned by a variety of points of view. Understanding of how money creation and inflation works. However, MMT economists disagree with mainstream economics about the fifth tenet. That is, the impact of government deficits on interest rates. And the point of focusing on that is that that's a very key element. You hear about it, the interest rate decisions by the Federal Reserve, et cetera, and it is a way in which you define the cost of money, um, problematic in all ways. Now, this paper that comes up next is available for free. It is at the Social Science Research site, and you can view it and critique it to your heart's content. I will breeze through it and then we'll see, and you can maybe ask questions. I'm not sure I can answer all the questions. It after money and banking courses, I always get confused about this stuff because in some ways, don't think you're meant to understand it all. All right. Introduction. Over the past 2 decades, this is a response to critics of modern money theory done by Scott Fulwiler, Stephanie Kelton, and Randy Ray. Introduction. Over the past 2 decades, a group of us have developed an alternative approach to monetary theory that integrates the insights of Knapp's 1924 state money approach, also called Chartalist and adopted by Keynes 1930, the credit money view of Innes of 1913-1914, Abba Lerner's 1943-47 functional finance approach, Minsky's 1986 of Alan Minsky. Alan Minsky is the son of, Hyman. Views of banking and Godley's 1996 sectoral balance approach. In addition, most of us have used our understanding of the operation of the monetary system to propose an employer of last resort or job guarantee program to provide an anchor to the value of the currency. Now that alone is controversial because it is the state, and um, but it does follow with the basic tenets of Keynesianism in that particular sense, and particularly if you extend certain things that Keynes was talking about in his later work besides the general theory. But anyway, the approach has come to be known as modern money theory (MMT), and has been widely debated and adopted, particularly on the blogosphere. Prominent economists such as Paul Krugman and Brad DeLong have taken notice and deemed it to be a theory of note, even if they don't accept all of it. Neither of them do. DeLong is I think he was an assistant secretary or deputy secretary in the Clinton administration. Of course, Paul Krugman from the New York Times and his Nobel Prize. Further, developers of MMT have been credited with foreseeing the global financial collapse as well as the troubles with the euro as early as the 1990s. Still, MMT has always had its critics. Somewhat surprisingly to us, some of the most vocal critics have been heterodox economists, particularly the post-Keynesians. We see nothing in the MMT approach that should be difficult for post-Keynesians to accept. Yet, in recent weeks, both Mark Lavoie and Brett Feibiger have provided critiques. It looks to us as if they have not understood our arguments. Instead of providing a point-by-point response to either of their papers, we think it would be more useful to briefly lay out our main argument in a way that should be accessible to post-Keynesians. We have been given only 1,000 words for this task. Note that post-Keynesian is collapsed into one little word there to save space. But anyway, we've been given 4,000 words for this task, hence we can only hit the main points. More specifically, this response will in turn discuss the role of endogenous money and the circuit for MMT, the MMT understanding of government debt operations, and the links between the MMT approach and heterodoxy in general. There are various terms that you'll hear in here. The circuitists, which is a French-Italian construction for people who believe in certain types of how um, circuits of capital ultimately operate. Well, we've talked about circuits before. This is somewhat similar. Endogenous money on the circuit, an entry for Keynesians into MMT. We find the French-Italian post-Keynesian circuit approach particularly useful for driving home the point that the finance for spending must come from somewhere. This is Graziani's 1990 paper. Most recognize that to finance a purchase, one needs to use income, to sell an asset, or to borrow. At the individual level, that's certainly true. Yet the finance that comes from income flows, as well as from the receipts of sales of assets, also must come from somewhere. And an infinite regress is not logically compelling. The typical neoclassical deus ex machina source of finance is savings. But if savings is in financial form, it must have been generated by somebody else's spending, which is also another infinite regress. Hence, when the circuitists begin with a bank loan to finance purchase of commodities, that is to be used to produce commodities, all logical problems are resolved. Spending and creation of money in the form of a bank deposit are linked. It's best to think of these as balance sheet entries. Remember, we're talking about double entry bookkeeping. The bank accepts the IOU of the borrower and credits her demand deposit. The borrower's IOU is offset by the credit to her deposit. Spending then simply shifts the demand deposit to a seller. Money is created endogenously to finance spending. Now, you may have been already lost by this, but this is sort of basic sort of how financial institutions operate, how the Federal Reserve Bank operates at a larger scale. But it generally is the same thing. It's about demand deposits and credits, et cetera. Later, when loans are repaid, the demand deposit as well as the borrower's IOU are debited. That is, money is destroyed. There's no magic involved, no manna from heaven, no separation of the real, that is, the IS curve, that if for those who've taken some econ, IS curve from the monetary LM curve. So it's supply and demand, just to to think of it simply in a macro sense. As Clower would remark, money buys goods and goods buy money, but goods do not buy other goods. And that's the complication that you could say that neoclassical economics ignores in some ways. Barter is ruled out as one must first obtain money from income flows, asset sales, or borrowing before doing any spending. And the money must get created with an initiating purchase. That's the idea behind the endogenous money approach adopted by post-Keynesians. That is, loans create deposits, and repayment of loans destroys deposits. Many post-Keynesians go further and adopt the horizontalist approach. That is, both the supply of loans and the supply of bank reserves are horizontal at an exogenously administered interest rate. That is, the interest rate is not affected by any of this stuff. That's Moore's position from 1988. We do not need to get into this in detail here, thank God, nor does a reader have to accept a horizontal supply of deposits and loans. We don't. The fundamental idea is that bank lending is never constrained by the deposits that flow into banks, since banks create deposits when they lend. However, as we know, banks must meet reserve requirements. That was the whole crux of the Depression. And banks use reserves for clearing. That is for, we're balancing the books, quote unquote. Here is where horizontal reserves come into play. Any central bank that administers an overnight interest rate target must supply reserves on demand, for otherwise it would lose control of the interest rate. In the post Keynesian literature, it is said that central bank policy always accommodates the demand for reserves. Given that this demand is highly interest inelastic, that doesn't move around a lot. That's, it's a mathematical thing about line slopes and blah, 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 blah. There is little room for error by the central bank. It must accommodate more or less exactly the demand. So it has a certain, equilibrium, as it were. We believe that this view is now widely accepted even by the mainstream. Modern central banks operate with an overnight interest rate target and accommodate bank demand for reserves in order to continuously achieve it. All of this is old ground and not really controversial, or should not be. Unless you're crazy. There's crazies out there, right, who have other agendas about money and etc. So, MMT, bringing the state into the circuit. What extension does modern money theory make? Number one, the money of account, at least today, is virtually always a state money of account. That is a dollar chosen by the authorities. Number two, the authorities issue the currency, which consists of notes, bills, paper stuff, and coins denominated in that money of account. And the central bank, whether it's legally independent or not, issues bank reserves in the same unit. Number three, the authorities impose taxes and other obligations in the same unit and accept their own liabilities, that is, notes, coins, reserves, together high powered money, HPM, high powered money, in payments to the state. Now, the issue of so-called high-powered money is, a fanciful at best, but interesting. The authorities issue high-powered money denominated in the same unit when they spend. And five, the authorities sell other types of generally longer-term liabilities denominated in the same unit, accepting their own high-powered money IOUs in payment for them. So that all seems, sort of a type that circulates properly. We would thus insist that any modern circuit should begin with the recognition that the bank money created at the beginning of the circuit is denominated in the state's money of account. Further, recognizing that banks use high power money for clearing, more specifically, the reserve balance option of high powered money, the circuit should also begin with high powered money. Now, we believe that this is now accepted by circuitistes like Parguay and Sarrecchia, who have explicitly put the state in the circuit. The final point we often make is that from inception, the authorities must levy an obligation, that is, fees, fines, or taxes, to ensure that the HPM, the high power money, will be accepted. However, we will not try to make this case here, and that's a lot of the other issues. We could say that the system that allowed that went, south, sort of, in during the Great Recession in 2008. Now, the question is, where does the high powered money come from? Is it manna from heaven? Is it part of humanity's initial endowment? Clearly, the answer is no. It comes from the state, as it is a state IOU denominated in the state's money of account. Now, there are two obvious ways that high powered money can get into the economy: state spending, buying, bullets, whatever, and state lending. You need to build something, some infrastructure thing, so there's lending that goes on. Banks cannot get a hold of high power money for hearing or high powered money for clearing or to meet reserve requirements unless the state lends or has spent high powered money into existence. Now, note the analogy to bank deposits. Banks must spend or lend them into existence. We've already noted that among post Keynesians, there's absolutely no disagreement, so far as we're aware, that loans make deposits. The common view that banks sit and wait for a deposit to come in before they make a loan must have the logical sequence backwards. It also has to be true that the state must spend or lend its high power money into existence before banks, firms, or households can get hold of coins, paper notes, or bank reserves. Now, we recognize that in developed countries today, there is a division of responsibilities between the Treasury and the central bank, and that the central bank, as in many nations, nominally independent of the state. We need not quibble about the degree to which the central bank is legally separate. In the US, for example, there's no question that the Fed was created by an act of Congress and that it is legally subject to Congress's will. That Congress prefers not to exercise much control over the Fed is beside the point in our view. And of course, they tell, you know, presidents to pound sand when they want to intervene on the interest rates, as Trump is tries to do. But as a first approximation, we prefer to consolidate Treasury and central bank operations. We then separate them for further analysis. Now, there are two questions for this, or two reasons for this: simplicity and generality. For most purposes, the user of high powered money, that is, banks, households, and firms, could care less whether it's an IOU of the Treasury or the central bank. They're just about perfectly substitutable. Consolidation also lets us first explain the simple proposition that government IOUs have to be spent or lent into existence, just like bank IOUs. And it allows us to postpone discussion of the particular operational details on how government really spends and lends its IOUs into existence, as these vary across time and nation. While most post-Keynesians are somewhat familiar with the case of the US, which separates the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Treasury, that's not the case in many nations today, where the central bank is explicitly the Treasury's bank. Nor was it true in the past, when all of the government's IOUs were spent and lent into existence directly by the Treasury. Remember that central banks are relatively recent inventions. To be sure, if modern money theory and analysis had stopped there, never going beyond the simplest analysis with a consolidated treasury and central bank into something called government. It would have been remiss, but that has never been the case. The earliest analyses detailed the operations between the central bank and the treasury. In the next section, we'll turn to those details. Let us first summarize the simplest, most general case. The issuer of the currency must supply it first before the users of the currency, that is, banks for clearing, households, firms for purchases, and tax payments have it. Before all those three entities get it. That makes it clear that government cannot sit and wait for tax receipts before it can spend, no more than the issuers of bank deposits, that is, banks, can sit and wait for deposits before they lend. So this is a fluid process. Government spends or lends high powered money into existence and receives back what it spent or lent. When taxes are paid or debts to government are repaid, that also means that at most, government can receive back in payments as much as it spent or lent. Over a period, of course, it might receive more or less than it spent or lended over that period, but it is impossible for government to receive cumulative payments to itself in its own currency that exceed its cumulative spending and lending any more than it's possible for the banking sector to receive greater payments to retire loans than its cumulative lending, as the circuit demonstrates. It's far more likely that government will receive less and the shortfall will equally, exactly equal the accumulation of balances of high powered money held by banks, households, and firms. Finally, not only must government spend or lend its high powered money into existence before it can receive the same high powered money in taxes, but logically, government must also spend or lend high powered money before government can borrow high powered money. Now, this may sound a little strange, but again, recalling the circuit, can banks in the aggregate borrow deposits before banks have created them? No. They must lend or spend, that is, buy assets, by creating deposits before deposits can exist. So there's always, this is the float right? Once deposits exist, a bank can, quote unquote, borrow them. That is, issue some non deposit liability to obtain a deposit. To be clear, a bank that has created a deposit liability on itself will not borrow its own deposit, but it can induce one of its depositors to give up the deposit in favor of some other bank liability, say subordinated debt or short-term commercial paper. This was the one of the troubles of 2008. It could also sell such debt to depositors of other banks, in which case it will receive a clearing drain in its favor. Now, this normally will take the form of a credit to its reserve account at the central bank, but it could also be a deposit in a correspondent bank, that is, so called country banks in England kept deposits in city banks in London that could be used for clearing before the creation of the Bank of England, for example. So there's a lot of it's a shell game in that sense. In the case of government, its borrowing is a substitution of its high-powered money liabilities for bills and bonds liabilities. It must first spend or lend the high-powered money into existence before it can borrow its high-powered money liabilities in exchange for bills and bonds. Exactly how that's done is a matter for the next section, and they can vary over time and across nations. It will typically involve the central bank today because the high powered money liabilities submitted to buy treasuries will mostly be reserve liabilities of the central bank. However, the final result would be the same if the Treasury were to sell its bonds for its own metal coins or for its own wooden tally stick debts, which and tally stick debts were a form. With all due respect, you can imagine how there are like these little slivers of wood that actually that physically exist in Britain. They have stacks of these suckers. Um, Operational details of government debt operations. Now, for the purposes of the simplest or most general explication, it's convenient to consolidate the Treasury and central bank accounts into a quote unquote government account. Now, to be sure, the real world is more complicated. There's a central bank and a treasury, and there's specific operational procedures adopted. In addition, there are constraints imposed on those operations. Two common and important constraints are A, the Treasury keeps a deposit account and a deposit account at the central bank and must draw upon that in order to spend. And B, the central bank is prohibited from buying bonds directly from the Treasury and from lending to the Treasury, which would directly increase the Treasury's deposit at the central bank. Now, there's a third constraint that we will not discuss further here. A government can promise to convert its own currency to a foreign currency or precious metal at fixed exchange rate. Now, obviously, this restricts fiscal and monetary policy space and is why MMT generally prefers a non convertible currency. But as Paul Davidson has frequently noted, the appropriate general case is the one that makes the fewest assumptions while enabling analysis or understanding of the fundamental or true nature of the object of inquiry. We argue that the appropriate general case is the consolidated Treasury Central Bank. But the reader should not confuse this attempt at defining a general case with a description of actual operations for any particular country. Now, unfortunately, this is precisely what our critics do repeatedly. Beginning with a simpler general case, consider a consolidated government, that is, a central bank plus treasury, running a deficit. Now, the basic transactions could be listed as the following. Now, this is going to get a little complicated here, but 1A, the government spending credits bank accounts with reserve balances of high powered money. These accounts are liabilities of the government or central bank. 2A, banks credit the deposit accounts of the spending recipients. So, overall, the increased reserve balances have raised bank assets, while the increased deposits have increased bank liabilities by the same amount. Further, because spending to the private sector is greater than taxes drawn from the private sector's net financial wealth has increased. The change to the government's financial position is necessarily the opposite. Its net financial wealth has been reduced. That is, the equity on the liability equity side of the government central bank balance sheet has been reduced. Now, this is the basic godly sectoral balance identity many are familiar with. 3A, absent interest on reserve balances, the government slash central bank issues bonds or offers time deposits to drain or otherwise replace the reserve balances of high-powered money created by the deficit if they're not consistent with banks' demand for reserve balances at the targeted interest rate. This is the horizontalist recognition that if actual reserves deviate from desired balances, the central bank must drain reserves to hit its interest rate target. Viewed this way, it's clear that the general case suggests the nature of a government deficit can be understood in three parts. Number one, the government is not constrained in its spending by its ability to acquire high powered money, since the spending creates high powered money, as in 1A and 2A. Spending does not require previous tax revenues, and indeed, it is previous spending or loans to the private sector that provide the funds to pay taxes or purchase bonds. Number two, the issuance of bonds in 3A is not for financing purposes, but for monetary policy purposes, so that the targeted interest rate can be achieved. Note that the government actually has a few options here. It can simply pay the interest on the reserve balances at the target rate, and the interest rate on the reserves resulting from the government's cumulative deficits will be equal to the target rate, aside from reserve balances replaced by the private sector's demand for currency, which earn no interest. It can issue short-term debt, that is, in the form of T-bills, treasury bills, or time deposits that will generally arbitrage with the target rate. Or it can issue long-term bonds or long-term time deposits that will mostly follow the current and expected future target rates. A still simpler option is to simply set the rates it's willing to pay for short or long-term bills, time deposits, or bonds, and allow the private sector to purchase the quantities it desires, while the rest of the deficit will simply remain as reserve balances. Clearly, none of these are financing operations. Number three, the government deficit did not crowd out the private sector's financial resources, but instead raised its net financial wealth, as in 2A. Again, from 2, the market does not set interest rates on the debt, or at the very least, the government has the option of always setting the rate on its own debt. Interest rates in the general case are merely a matter of political economy. One could obviously have separated the Treasury and central bank instead of consolidating, but this simply adds assumptions and intermediate steps without changing the nature of the operations and would thus be less general. Indeed, it has the potential of masking the true nature of the operations in our view, which makes it decidedly less useful as a starting point. To continue, now consider how operations are really done in the US, where the Treasury really does hold accounts in both private banks and the Fed, but can write checks only on its account at the Fed. Further, the Fed is prohibited from buying treasuries directly from the Treasury, that is, buying Treasury bonds directly from the Treasury, and is not supposed to allow overdrafts on Treasury accounts. And thus, the Treasury must have a positive balance in its account at the Fed before it spends. Therefore, prior to spending, the Treasury must replenish its own account at the Fed either via balances collected from taxes and other revenues or debt issuance to the open market. Pause for one moment to ponder that. The Treasury cannot issue IOUs directly to the government's own bank, that is the Fed, but must instead issue them to any other bank to obtain deposits that are then transferred to its own bank. That is, this is a self-imposed constraint. Now imagine imposing such a constraint on a private firm. It can issue an IOU to anybody except its own bank. Clearly, this self-imposed constraint is anything but natural and cannot be useful for describing a general case for government debt operations. Now, some of this is, historical and involves a lot of other monkey business, and we can probably talk about that history at some other point. As a result, in the US case, there are at least 6 transactions related to deficit operations rather than 3 in the general case. Now, this elaboration of deficit operations is partially because you've got Trump-like people who love debt and get the system to create all these other little methods or instruments or operations to finagle the system. 1B, The Fed undertakes repurchase agreement operations with primary dealers, in which the Fed purchases Treasury securities from primary dealers with a promise to pay them back at a specific date. To ensure sufficient reserve balances are circulating for settlement of the Treasury's auction, which will debit reserve balances in bank accounts as the Treasury's account is credited, while also achieving the Fed's target rate. It is well known that settlement of Treasury auctions are high payment flow days that necessitate a larger quantity of reserve balances circulating than on other days, and the Fed accommodates the demand. Note that the point here is not that the Fed necessarily engages in operations that are equal to or greater than the auction, but that the operations ensure that sufficient balances circulate such that the auction settles without the effective federal funds rate for the day moving above the target rate. This requires that the balances already in circulation, plus those added via operations, are sufficient to settle the auction and enable banks in the aggregate to end the day with their desired positions at the target rate largely equal to actual positions. There's a whole business about trying to get the thing to even out. Otherwise, volatility occurs. 2B, the Treasury's auction settles as Treasury securities are exchanged for reserve balances, so bank reserve accounts are debited to credit the Treasury's account, and dealer accounts at banks are debited. Treasury auctions can only settle via reserve balances using the Fed's Fedwire clearing and settlement system. Imagine how complicated that was before, computers. The auction itself is an asset swap is an asset swap of reserve balances and thus do not affect the private sector's net wealth. The Treasury adds balances credited to its account, 3B, from the auction settlement to tax and loan accounts. This credits the reserve accounts of the banks holding the credited tax and loan accounts. 4B, transactions 4B and 5B are interchangeable. That is, in practice, transaction 5B might occur before transaction 4B. That is, the Fed's repurchase agreement is reversed as the second leg of the repurchase agreement occurs, in which a primary dealer, I guess Goldman, purchases Treasury securities back from the Fed. Transactions in A above are reversed. 5B, prior to spending, the Treasury calls in balances from its tax and loan accounts at banks. This reverses the transactions in 3B. 6B, the Treasury deficit spends by debiting its account at the Fed, resulting in a credit to bank reserve accounts at the Fed and the bank accounts of spending recipients. This increases the net financial wealth of the private sector. As with the general case above, the analysis is much the same in the case of a deficit created by a tax cut instead of an increase in spending. And without trying to get into this, and not that I understand it that well, this is why this tax cut is looming for a variety of reasons. That is, with a tax cut, the Treasury spending is greater than revenues just as it is with proactive deficit spending. What MMT stresses is that regarding 1, 2, and 3 above, the end result is exactly as stated in the general case. So even though with the procedures adopted due to the self-imposed constraint, the transactions are now more complex and the sequencing is different. Regarding lowercase 1, recall that only reserve balances can settle Treasury auctions via Fedwire, and the only sources of Federal Reserve balances over time, that is, aside from various short-term effects from autonomous changes to the Fed's balance sheet. Anyway, that is, reserve balances over time are loans from the Fed or the Fed's purchases of financial assets either outright or in repurchase agreements. The Fed normally purchases Treasury securities or requires Treasury securities as collateral for repurchase agreements. In the aftermath of the global crisis, the Fed has engaged in highly unusual purchases of a wider variety of assets and has lent against various kinds of assets. And we kind of got a peek at that by looking at Michael Hudson's work. Since existing Treasury securities were issued as a result of a previous government budget deficit, it is the case that the reserve balances required to purchase Treasury securities are the result of a previous government deficit or a loan, including repurchase agreements or purchases of private sector securities from the Fed to the non-government sector. This is true even though the Treasury must have a positive balance in its account before it can spend, and even though the Fed is legally prohibited from providing the Treasury with overdrafts in its account due to the quote unquote self imposed constraint. Now, regarding lowercase 2, the Treasury's tax and loan account operations are for the purposes of aiding the Fed's liability no, the Fed's ability to achieve the target rate, as is well established in the Fed's own literature and annual reports. And while the Treasury must issue bonds in order to replenish its own account when it runs a deficit, again, as with lowercase 2 above, the interest rate on these bonds is largely determined by arbitrage against the Fed's target rate. Now, this suggests that the self-imposed constraint is not really a constraint at all. Recall that in the general case, the government has a choice of spending with no bond sales while it pays the target rate on reserve balances or issuing debt at essentially the central bank's target rate. For the U.S., the former is analogous to a scenario with no self-imposed constraint and with the Treasury obtaining overdrafts to its account at the Fed when it deficit spends, whereas the latter is obviously what occurs now with no overdrafts allowed. In other words, prohibiting overdrafts leaves the Treasury issuing bonds that arbitrage against the Fed's target rate. There's no economically significant difference if given the choice between an overdraft at the target rate or issuing debt at roughly the target rate. It's not economically significant for the Treasury's purposes if the former choice is then prohibited. And while the Treasury may issue longer term bonds and can be issued at significantly higher interest rates than the Fed's target rate for both the general and U.S. cases, this is a choice, not anything enforced by private debt markets. Even under current operations, interest rates are a matter of political economy rather than being set in a loanable funds market or subject to the whims of bond vigilantes. Regarding lowercase 3, the private sector's net financial wealth has been increased by the amount of the deficit. That is, the different sequencing of the Treasury's debt operations does not change the fact that deficits add net financial assets rather than crowding out private sector financial resources. Indeed, primary dealers finance their purchases of bonds at auction in the repo market, mostly using treasuries as collateral, while the newly issued bond will likely serve as collateral for further credit creation in financial markets. So, far from crowding out, bonds can actually enable further credit creation than it would in their absence. In summary, separating the Treasury and the Fed and adding the rule that the Treasury must finance its operations in the open market results in the 6 transactions described above for the Treasury's debt operations compared to the 3 simpler operations in the general case. Nevertheless, the nature of these operations, as described by the general case of a consolidated government central bank balance sheet, or the results described in lowercase 1, 2, and 3, all remain completely intact. Unfortunately, and most importantly, the added complexity is counterproductive because it leads to poor understanding among economists, poor modeling, and bad policy choices. Were economists and policymakers to understand that the MMT general case explains the true nature of government debt operations, we suggest that all 3 could be markedly improved. So the upshot of this is that for a variety of reasons, which are historical and also because of the scale at which they've operated, I would assume. It's very, very complicated, but in some ways, it's designed that way in order to actually, in the big picture, maintain stability, particularly with weird fiscal policy. Now, why the right framework matters. It's impossible for anyone to develop a perfect model of the macroeconomy, one that incorporates all of the fluid activities that take place in a world rich with institutional detail, where humans engage in a vast variety of complex economic decision making. The most widely accepted mainstream models do not even try. Instead, they abstract from the complexities of the real world, replacing involuntary unemployment with revealed preferences, fundamental uncertainty with calculable risk, central bankers with helicopter pilots, and so on. This is, what neoclassical economics has wrought. In contrast, heterodox economists working in the post-Keynesian and institutionalist traditions have worked to produce a more realistic framework from which to analyze and understand the workings of a modern capitalist economy. As a group, we, that is Fulwiler, Keltman, Ray, have contributed to the post-Keynesian and institutionalist literature, served on their editorial boards, and as members of their boards of directors organized their annual conferences and summer schools, presented countless papers, organized panels, and so on. We are, in other words, part of this community of scholars. Lately, however, we've been accused of departing too sharply from the post-Keynesian tradition and of attempting to compete with our heterodox friends by rebranding ourselves with the MMT label. We've been asked, where did this name come from? Why do you need to distinguish yourself from the rest of us? Why are you getting so much attention? One of the more vocal opponents of MMT, in an apparent moment of weakness, even confessed that there's a lot of jealousy in the heterodox community over the success that the MMTers have achieved. We cannot know what motivates those who would prefer to focus on our subtle differences in style rather than our significant similarities in substance. As a theoretical school of thought, MMT draws heavily on John Maynard Keynes's analysis of monetary production economy, Abba Lerner's theory of functional finance, Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, Godley's sectoral balance approach to macro modeling, and the work of G.F. Knapp and A. Mitchell Innes, who independently developed chartalist or state theories of money. These are our forefathers, our foremothers, and MMT is an amalgamation of their most important contributions. Now, some have used this admission to attack and trivialize our contributions, insisting that MMT has really added nothing new. But this strikes us as unfair, not to mention inaccurate, for it was the pulling together of these ideas into a coherent whole that allowed us to develop the general framework described in this paper. And it is from this integrated framework that we've been able to understand events, assess policies, and derive policy proposals for real world economies operating with very different institutional systems. Thus, it is the entire collection of ideas that it has enabled us to make meaningful sense of events in domestic and global markets. For example, our framework has helped us to understand the dynamics of debt default under fixed exchange rates, that's the Russian case, why the the CBO's projection, the Congressional Budget Office, a projection of surpluses as far as the eye can see, that's the Clinton years, was destined to miss the mark, while the Stability and Growth Pact would not restrict government deficits, how default risk premiums would lead to a debt crisis in the Eurozone, why quantitative easing would not cause runaway inflation, why the sharp increase in the U.S. deficit would not cause U.S. interest rates to rise, why the Fed's zero interest rate would fail to restore a private credit expansion, et cetera, et cetera. We have never tried to separate our MMT approach from the heterodox tradition we share with the post-Keynesian institutionalists and others. We've tried to extend that tradition to study the nature of modern money, that is, state money as defined by Knapp and Keynes. We include a detailed analysis of the way money works in modern fiscal and monetary policy operations, and we examine the policy implications and possibilities that follow on from this analysis. Now, this is all inside baseball, but it would be interesting, with all due respect, to run counterfactual operations, which I assume somebody's doing, not me, on certain, sort of data sets that would allow us to, and in fact, that's kind of what goes on with lots of rehashing of the 2008 crisis. And unless you think that's unimportant, there are still people doing quant work on, the Great Depression I mean, pretty much the analysis is settled, but there are still folks going in there and sort of fiddling around with the numbers, mainly because that's got a lot of moving parts. And so we're not even done with, somebody is probably fiddling around with the 2008 crisis and trying to measures certain key moments which were historically identified. That's the advantage of reading the Michael Hudson piece, is that it tries to give a reasonable and not a business journalist timeline for the activities, and one that is measured against certain institutional decision making, which I think that's what Hudson's work is good for, to see. Oh, well, they screwed it all up within, 2 weeks or whatever. That there was a certain set of decisions that had certain people not been idiots, it wouldn't have gone south. But anyway, so that's my little yammering on this. It's a reasonable little paper. I think you probably need to know how Treasury and the Fed operate a little bit more. I've included a video with Randy Ray and others, and I included a more recent Michael Hudson explaining why banking isn't what you think it is, and that goes on for over an hour. So if you have further interest in this, and it seems a little arcane, but ultimately, as I said at the beginning, it is about getting the state to take better control of fiscal operations and the money system. I mean, it is one that requires a little bit more, not so much direction of the money system, but attending to all of the moving parts, which the current set of idiots certainly doesn't. The ones before did a little bit better, but then they were trying to uh, try and not to juggle too many balls in the air. And these kinds of decisions are highly problematic because they have corporate implications, public implications, government implications in terms of congressional action. And you can obviously see in the need, and which has still not been implemented in terms of politicians being more sacrosanct in their investment behavior while in office. And that's a whole nother thing. But you can see that certain other things have been run roughshod. And of course, in the current state, in the last 2 months, we've had uh, elimination of controls on certain elements, and some people are going to make a lot more money this year. And whether that has any public significance will probably be difficult to identify, let's put it that way, aside from all the distractions that are being thrown at us. Okay, so that's pretty much all I need to say today. Yes, it is greasy. It is greasy, Larry. Um, no, he doesn't. Um, he doesn't go to the nuances of, you didn't have that many institutions that existed. And remember, volume three is constructed from manuscript notes. So he doesn't have all the data. He's not looking at what is much more complicated machinery of an economy, particularly in the post 1870 period. I just don't think he was, you know, plotting away at it. In fact, I think that's generally why he wanted to leave um, the later chapters of the 6 volume version of Capital to a more historical and international or global kind of treatment, because he figured, well, I think I can get a handle on all this. But in the intervening years, of course, we have the American Civil War, we have the Franco-Prussian War, we have other stupid things. So it never, I don't think that you don't get a sense of how Fed, of how central bank. It's just that gap. That's why there's the need to look at monetary theory, which only occurred in the post-war period, and of course the more recent attention to modern money theory, just because people are just trying to set it into a kind of more proper historical framework. Um, FAIM to ISO 2022 Fedwire formats. I have no idea what that is. I mean, I know that there's standards formatting that has shifted, and for good reason because of we've got better computers now too. So all of that. Yes, it's government discretion, or well, no, it's bank discretion too. It depends. It depends what you're doing with it. There's discretionary elements built into Fed policy. There's, um, and it is done, centrally rather than in the regional banks. So yeah, but it's not. There's a reason, and and what MMT is pointing out is it a good reason to because the idea of merging central bank and treasury is to reduce some of the if nothing else, from a very simplified institutional analysis, the transaction costs involved in this little game between the Fed and the Treasury that goes on. Um, and I think they did it simply because the velocity was being cranked up over the years. Things just move faster, and on the one hand, you get a benefit from it slightly from this slight lag built into it in terms of making adjustments and corrections, so that other kinds of decisions don't get too out of control, particularly just within the activity of the national economy, because you have all these damn banks. They're not just doing domestic stuff, they're obviously doing international stuff, and it gets really much more complicated, and things can get lost. My favorite example, my current favorite example, is somebody challenged the idea that Trump is a Russian asset, uh, demanding. This is a comment in Daily Kos. There's, oh, I need a lot more evidence to show that Trump is a Russian asset. Well, it's pretty clear that there are certain periods he went to Russia, or he screwed around with the Russians for one thing or another. And it's not a matter of prostitutes and beds or anything. It's simply that he took a trip somewhere, he hung around with some Russians, and for some reason, he comes back with a passel of, or he appears to be more loanable, and so in the case in the late 80s, he comes back with something like 400 million to buy the Ritz or whatever the hell he did during that period. And in the later period, this is that thing with Justice Kennedy and his son, who was a banker at Deutsche Bank. Um, he borrows, or he gets 300 million in loans from a fund that, yes, the only way that he could have gotten it is if somebody, i.e., the Russians, had signed off on the loan. And it's pretty clear that they were the only people doing that kind of loaning. Now we have the Saudis and a bunch of other crazy crap. So that's kind of where we are now. So just to give you a current sort of state of, yes, yes, and that hotel that cratered in, that's right. This is the Soho thing, for which in an associate, and when you look at it's really complicated, but yes, the FBI, the FIB had, or the Justice Department had Trump in to talk about some things, and I guess he complied or gave up some people. 2007, I think. But yes, but ultimately it still is the Deutsche Bank loan that this is the second time, of course, that Trump got saved, and he just keeps going on. He just, you know, his debt gets bigger and bigger. Okay, so that's about all I can yammer about, and all I should yammer about, because otherwise I don't know anything. Let me stop share.